Bonnie J. Skinner, welcome to the show.
Batman, thank you so much. Pleasure to be here.
Oh, it's a wonderful morning having you on here. I've been looking forward to this, and I'm not going to lie.
I've been excited myself.
Good, good. We're going to get into a ton of tactical stuff for the listeners, but before we dive in, give us just a little bit of a background of who you are and how you got into the fields that you got into.
Okay, yeah. So I'm Bonnie Skinner, and I ended up where I am now in executive coaching, kind of via psychotherapy. So I am a trained and registered psychotherapist. Own a practice in northern Ontario. I've had that practice here for 5 years. I started in public education and kind of work my way up. I do have a couple of clinicians that are working for me, but one of the things that kind of moved me more into the executive coaching sphere was just around kind of identifying some of the struggles that business owners and executives were having that didn't necessarily respond to the traditional um, therapeutic modalities and kind of really required a little bit more of a coaching stance. And so I'm sure we'll talk about that a little bit more later, but that's kind of how I ended up now as an executive coach.
And what made you want to work with entrepreneurs?
I have loved entrepreneurship, I think, since I was a child. So, I mean, that's no secret if you know me. Um, but there's something about just the passion that entrepreneurs have, and that those that want to build businesses, like we're talking about people that eat, sleep, and drink constantly, and those are just my people. And I think also one of the big values I have in both of my businesses is exponential impact. And I believe in when you can help one person that is determined to help many more, that's just so much better. So you get that, especially with entrepreneurs and CEOs.
Now, while a lot of the lessons and the things we're going to talk about apply directly to some of the experiences you've had in working with business owners and C-level executives, how does some of this apply to just the average Joe or Jane that's looking to continue their path towards self-development and growth?
I think all of it is applicable across the board. The biggest difference is the arena in which high level business leaders constantly surround themselves. So we know that you know business is hard, and it doesn't let up because you had a death in the family, you're sick, you're tired, you had kids. Like it's constant all the time. So when I'm working with business owners, I'll tailor, some of the strategies around just living in that constant state of high pressure. But in reality, these kind of methods apply to everybody.
Now, you like to kind of encapsulate all this and call it mental fitness. What is mental fitness and why should people care about it?
That's a great question. Probably one of my favorite questions. So, if you, for example, you live in the physical fitness world, right, and probably a lot of your listeners do too. And in the physical fitness world, you know that if I am physically healthy, that really means that nothing's wrong. My body's working the way that it should, right? But let's say that I'm out one day, walking my dog, and I trip and sprain my ankle. Okay, so now I'm what we call injured. Okay, this maybe like a physical illness. There's something wrong with my body. It's not working, not able to work the way that it should. Okay, so I'm in a state of maybe not great physical health in that moment, in that specific instance. But once my ankle heals and I go back, like I'd be considered healthy again. But that doesn't mean that, okay, I've got a level of fitness that means, okay, you'll see Bonnie at the next Olympics, right? The reality is you probably won't, because we know that there's a lot of beyond level conditioning that you need to be able to compete at that level, right? So it's the same thing with mental health. So with mental health, we have the absence of illness. It means that our cognitive faculties, our ability to solve problems, our ability to remember, our ability to have emotionally appropriate levels of emotional response, all of those things are doing what they should. That's mental health, right? That's the absence of illness. If we have, what we'll call mental illness, maybe somebody struggling with anxiety or depression or anything, with regards to the mental health spectrum, then that is the absence of health, right? That's something's not working the way that we would expect or intend it to or want it to. But if you remove that illness, again, that doesn't mean that you're at an optimized state of mental health. It just means that you have things are working the way that they're supposed to, right? There's a baseline there. When we're talking about mental fitness, I'm really talking about an optimized state of psychological health. Right? And so we're talking about the ability not just to problem solve, but to problem solve under extreme pressure, right? And persistent pressure. We're talking about things like being able to navigate the relationships needed to have a good, solid leadership base, right? So there's a whole variety of skills that actually represent optimizing your cognitive and psychological capabilities. And that is really what mental fitness is about.
So to that analogy, one thing that makes me think about is I feel like one of the reasons why people struggle so much on the mental fitness side of things is in the physical world, so much is under our own control, right? In the way of the movements we choose, the load we put on the bar, like how hard we push ourselves, the amount that we push ourselves in terms of like frequency and all the exercise selection, right? So it's like there's so much is within our control, but in the mental side of things, like you could be checking all the boxes and you still have that nagging voice in your head, right? So I would look at it like the analogy would be in the physical space world, it would be like your body's not doing what it's supposed to be doing. And you're confused as to why. You're like, please stop kicking my leg, right? Like that's not the intention. So how do we grapple with that in the mental fitness space?
The biggest thing is what you just said, right? It's really about how we understand it. And the problem with a lot of, not just CEOs, but everybody is we don't understand how our mind works or what our mind is capable of, right? So for example, let's say you are, you're struggling with cyclic periods of burnout. Okay. Then if you know and understand that, hey, listen, I'm going to burn out if my outputs or the things that I'm doing, right, take more energy than I'm putting in, right? That's fairly reasonable once you say it out loud. But if you don't know that, then you get caught in that mental internal dialogue where it's like, what's wrong with me? Everybody else is fine. Why can't I do it? And so sometimes it literally just comes down to a case of knowing. And so when I started my company, Level Up Coaching, Level Up Mental Fitness Coaching, it was really about helping entrepreneurs and business owners understand what to expect from their mind and what to expect from their psychology just because of the arena that they choose to be in.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, you break this down into a framework. So when you're breaking this down for business owners, what are some of the pillars that you that act as essentially buckets that all these things dump into?
Yeah, absolutely. So there are 6 pillars that I teach my clients. The first one is mental acuity, right? And so all of these pillars kind of hold up your overall sense of physical health. The first one is mental health, mental fitness. The first one is mental acuity. Mental acuity, quite simply, is the ability to problem solve effectively and quickly, right? So it's how efficient are we in problem solving? Now there's lots of things that can contribute to that. One might be my situational awareness. How good am I at identifying that there's a problem in the first place, right? And maybe I'm in a phase of my life where like I'm just oblivious to everything, or I'm tired, so I'm not picking things up, right? Anything can get in the way of us being able to identify problems. Once you identify a problem, you need to be able to understand its impact, right? You need to know why it needs to be fixed. And then you need to be able to come up with a plan to fix it. And then once you have a plan, you need to be able to implement that plan. Once you implement that plan, then you've got to be able to close up and effectively move on from that problem. And business leaders can get caught in any one of those situations, right? We all know people that, they're perfectionists. They can't stop working on a problem, right? Or some people are oblivious. They don't see the problems. And some people see the problems, but they can't manage their resources well enough to be able to solve it. Okay.
How important do you believe it is to create a definitive finish line in problem solving?
It's massively important. Massively important. You can have ill-defined, like you can have kind of wishy-washy kind of lines in the sand for longer term things, but when it comes right down to like what am I supposed to be doing in the now, in the short term, they have to be crystal clear, right? Because if not, that's how you get mission drift and confusion and all that stuff. And then once you get into the realm where nothing is clear, everything costs more to your psychological capacity. So when you're operating in a state of confusion, a state of fatigue, all of that kind of stuff, when you have a lack of clarity, that's really when you start compromising your performance. So that
How
we
do you
don't get it.
separate clarity from denial with entrepreneurs?
Ooh. It really depends on the example, to be honest with you. So I would see clarity as knowing what I want to do, why I want to do it, and how it needs to be done. Right. So I've got a level of like precision in all of those steps. Whereas denial is really more about maybe convincing myself that something doesn't need to be done. Right. Or convincing myself of, okay, this problem really isn't solved yet. So I better stick to it. Right. I think those things, but they may have some overlap, but they probably play out in fairly different domains, I think.
That makes sense. So we got mental acuity, which is basically problem solving start to finish.
That's
What's
right.
next
That's
up?
pillar number one. The second pillar is mental fortitude. So in the gym, this is the equivalent to like how much can you lift, right? It's how much can you handle? So how much adversity in any given moment can you handle, right? So if it's you just found out that somebody took money out of the till they shouldn't have taken, right? And then you open up and you got a bill that's overdue, and you've got all of these things that are all happening, and it seems to be like on a Monday morning between 8 and 9 o'clock all at once, right? How much can you handle before it starts to compromise your performance, right? And all of these pillars are performance related. When we talk about fitness, we're talking about optimized performance. Okay. um, so things that impact your fortitude might be things like adversity acceptance. So how well does your definition of success build in adversity, right? Because if your definition of success is like, oh, I should just go learn something and go out and do it the first time and knock it out of the park, and I'm going to open a business, and in 6 months I'm going to hit six figures and I'm not going to have any problems, and there's no inclination of struggle in there. There's no suggestion of like, hey, some setbacks. Then when the setbacks come, what happens is they create more shock and they disrupt you emotionally more than they need to, right? And so that adversity acceptance is a very important piece.
I have some interesting questions in regards to this one. So the first would be, how does someone improve their capacity over time?
You have to identify. So if you think of capacity like a cup, okay, and imagine that we all have these one cups that when it's full, like we're at max capacity, everything feels easy. We've got lots of energy. We can do lots of things without too much of a hassle. Okay. But everything we have to do comes out of that one cup. So as you move through your day, as you move through your week or your year, your quarter, that cup gets drained. Now, the way to keep that cup full is to figure out what pours into that cup for me. Now, for some people, that's solitude, right? Some people are like, listen, I'll go out and you can put me wherever you need me, but in order to recharge, I have to be away. I have to recharge. I want to give me a book on a rainy day. Some people are like, I got to get my workouts in consistently, right? And it doesn't have to be either or, right? You think about it as there are, everything we do is an output, but our inputs are the things I usually tell people, like, they give you that feeling, right? When you're doing it, you're like, oh my God, this is great. I don't do this enough. That's how you know something's an input. And we tend to think of those, when I say we, I'm thinking entrepreneurs, we tend to think of those things as being, well, it'd be nice if I had time for that. Or, I'll get around to that at some point. As soon as I get a minute, I'll do that. And we treat it like it's not essential, but it is very essential, right? It's the equivalent of putting gas in our car. Right? And so we need that to keep moving forward. So back to your question of how do we increase our capacity, is about identifying the things that fill our cup, the things that help us create new energy, and engaging in those things regularly.
There's a saying that I use quite frequently especially with parents that are kind of sidestepping their own health and fitness, as a martyr essentially for their children.
Yeah.
And I'll say to them, like, and this isn't my saying, I got this from someone else, but I say, you don't give from your own cup, you give from that which overflows around your cup. And the point being is, like, you have to have the inputs necessary to take care of your own health, or you won't even have anything left to give.
It really comes down to a lack of understanding sometimes around like how important it is for us to have full capacity. Because when we get to that point where that cup's starting to get empty, you'd be surprised the things that change, right down to our perspective. So our ability to respond to things is largely, dependent upon how we make sense of them, right? Like Bonnie gets angry about, something John did based on the story I tell myself. So if I say, oh, he shouldn't have done that, and I can't believe how much he's disrespecting me, that's going to make me angry because of the story that I told myself. But when we get tired, we are more likely to tell ourselves negative stories. We're more likely to interpret the things that happen to us as bigger, more impactful, and more catastrophic. Okay. So it's not just about, going out and getting a massage because, you want to feel good about yourself one day a week, or whatever the case may be. It's not that. We're talking about really filling the cup that is going to generate how we see the world and how we respond to the things that happen to us. And as CEOs and business leaders, like, we need to be on point about our perceptions.
Yeah. And also in times where maybe there's a seasonality of life where you do have to give more than you have, but there's an acceptance that there's going to have to be a backing off to the same degree, right? In proportion to what you just gave. That's after this season of life. And I think part of the issue, and I've dealt with this personally, is you're like, okay, quarter one, I'm going all in, and then quarter two, I'll dial back. And then at the end of quarter one, you see the progress and you're like, oh no, I'm ramping up again. Right. Yeah. And eventually the fall off happens.
Yeah, absolutely. And what I'll usually tell my clients in that is, like, if you know that you're going to go really hard for quarter one, you need to figure out where can you fit in those restorative practices. So it might be something as simple as like blocking off the first hour a day and not letting anybody talk to you. Right. It could be, instead of sitting at your desk at lunchtime and, shoving your food down your throat and then getting back on calls, you actually get up, walk down to wherever, a park, and sit there and eat your lunch and then come back. Like, it doesn't need to be massive, and it shouldn't disrupt your schedule, but restorative blocks shouldn't wait. They should be built in, right? Like, we wouldn't say, okay, I'm going to drive from Florida to California, right? But I'll fill up when I get to California. Like, we all know how absurd that sounds, right? But yet we do it all the time. Right? We do it all the time to ourselves. We say, yeah, okay. When I get there, and that recovery block ends up always being over the horizon, and that's what contributes to burnout and overwhelm, right? And that will cripple performance.
Now, do you ever see people who get almost addicted to constantly adding things to the list because they're seeking adversity, almost like it's an addiction, to where if things get to be, if they're content or things are working well, they can't just let it ride for a little bit. They have to immediately go and like push the growth button.
Yeah. Yes. 100%. When I see that in particular with, like I said, with the clients that I lead, the business avatars, because a lot of times that's the thing that gets them into business, right? Like, they get into business either wanting to control something, fix something, or change something, right? And that is like hey, like, you've got a vision and you've got an idea, and now you want to go, right? But there was something about not being able to sit with the way things were that drove them into business in some way, in a lot of cases. Okay. So what we often don't realize is that learning what has to happen afterwards. So your business up, it's running, you got people running it for you, whatever the case may be. Now you've got all this free time. So whatever caused you to get into business in the first place is going to show back up when you get free time. Okay. Now, sometimes it's just a case of liking to be busy. And if that's the case, then you'll be like, okay, well, let me find something to be busy. But what I say to folks is, it's a really great opportunity to slow down and say, well, what happens when things are still for me? Right? Like, what is that feeling? Is it the feeling of, oh my God, I think I'm going to be, judged as lazy if I'm not working? I have some of my clients who say, well, I feel guilty because I want to go golfing in the middle of the day, and I know that my staff are at my business working, and I feel like, well, I should be there. Right? But whatever it is, in that stillness, you have the ability then to learn what really drives you. So it's like, you want to be busy, that's fine, but you can go be busy and then, just drown yourself in it. Or you can say, that's really interesting. What's my struggle with staying still? Right? Because the last thing you want to do is anything out of compulsion. Right? That goes back to that doing things intentionally and mindfully. And a compulsion is just that feeling of like, oh my God, this feels yucky, let me go do something.
Would you say this is where we kind of like toe the line between productivity and busyness?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah.
Okay, so we got mental fortitude now. That pillar is focused around the more or less that's the capacity for the amount of things that you can handle.
Yeah. Capacity really lends itself to emotional regulation. Okay. And it's when I say emotional regulation, it's just your emotions are congruent to the situation you're in. Right. We've all seen people like what we'll call overreact. Like, some small thing will happen, they'll just kind of lose their mind.
So is that the third pillar, emotional
No,
regulation?
so no, that's the second pillar. So that's a part of fortitude, right?
Got it.
The third pillar is mental endurance. So whereas fortitude is how much adversity can you manage at one time, endurance is how much adversity can you manage over time before it starts to impact your performance. So all of the pillars are always talking about how do you maintain what does it take to maintain that high performance baseline. So for um, endurance, it's really about how well can I duplicate myself and how well can I get as much done with as little impact on my capacity as well. So this is the leadership pillar, right? This is where I'm now pulling people in. I might be responsible for selling a vision or helping people see where I want the company to go, maybe training them and teaching them how to, make decisions in my absence or whatever the case may be. But this is really where you learn to connect and lead with others. The fourth pillar is mental awareness. Now, a lot of folks will treat mental awareness with kind of two sides. Body awareness, which is like, how does my body feel and how does the state that my body is in affect my performance? And what's the state that my mind is in and how does that affect my performance, right? Both are incredibly important, but I'll add even a third one, which is relational, right? Your relational awareness. How effectively can you walk into a room and understand the dynamics of what's going on in that room, right? If I say, hey, if I was to ask your general manager, what's Derek like to work for, right? How close are the stories he would give me and you would give me? And then why are they different? Right? So we tend not to think of those things as being important. A lot of people say, oh, I don't care if people thinking about me. And it's like, well, you got to on some level. You don't need to obsess about it, but it's important. We want to be able to have a good, solid awareness of the state of our relationships and the state of ourselves, because we want to know if there's anything we need to protect when it comes to our performance.
Now, obviously, awareness is kind of the base and step one. How do we get from awareness to regulation?
If you are aware, so the first thing is to be aware. Usually what we become aware of is a behavior, right? And something outward. So I become aware of maybe a behavior pattern, right? So like, oh, when that person shows up, I'm constantly irritated, right? That might be a behavior. Oh, when Sally's around, I want to bite everybody's head off. What is it about me or what is it about Sally, right? And then once you recognize whatever it is that has come into your awareness, that's when you can take a position of curiosity and say, like, well, why? Why is that? Right? If we slow down enough, we go, that's a really interesting reaction I'm having to so and so showing up. Instead of like, oh my God, what's wrong with so and so? Why are they always around when I'm around? Right? We can stop and kind of turn inward and go, oh, that's a really great opportunity to build awareness. Right? Now, there's a million different ways that can go. We don't have time in the podcast to do that, but it's those really emotional moments, those things that kind of grip you. You're like, wow, I've got a feeling here. That's a great opportunity to say, that's really interesting. Why does that affect me that way? And that's really a lot of what I help entrepreneurs with, is because they tend to push away those feelings and just work through them, ignore them, act like they don't happen. The problem is if you do that with something that's significant. So maybe when Sally shows up, it's like, I feel like I can't be myself. I feel like I can't be safe. If I don't deal with that, if I'm not aware of that, know that that's the pattern, and such that I can't fix it, then every time I'm around Sally, my performance is going to be compromised because I'm going to split my attention between what she's doing and what's going on over there and what I'm trying to accomplish myself. So
That's interesting. That makes sense.
Mental awareness. Yeah. The next pillars, there's two more pillars. The next one is mental recovery. What a lot of people say is like, the job is to get good so that you don't have to recover, and that is not it, right? Because you got to think about, as entrepreneurs, we tend to want to live at the edge of our skills, right? At the edge of that skill set, so that we're always, growth lives outside of your comfort zone. We've all heard that. Well, a lack of skills also, you're going to bump up against that edge where it's like, wow, this is actually kind of hard for me, or that there's a lot of challenges. And so when you have a lot of challenges, you expect that sometimes you're going to get overwhelmed. Sometimes you're going to burn out. That's okay. But what we want to do when it comes to mental recovery is we want to know how to recover before we have to. I see too many people that are in a state of burnout trying to figure out how to solve their problems. When in a state of burnout, that's the last time you should be doing any kind of decision making.
What are some red flags that people should look out for?
Knee-jerk reactions, right? So if you're feeling like, okay, I'm responding with irritation or a negative emotion to a lot of things, whereas normally I wouldn't, that's usually very telling, right? But at the same time, you can have a lot of folks that when they're overwhelmed, they become very passive. Yeah, dude, I don't care. Yeah, okay, whatever. Yeah, I'll do that tomorrow, right? Or they're avoidant, right? They procrastinate. Everybody has um, different ways of responding to overwhelm based on what their experiences were and a whole lot of other things. But part of understanding that pillar is to ask yourself, well, how do I know when I'm not okay? Right? Like, what does that look like? Does it look the same as for Derek as it does for Bonnie? Right? Well, Derek gets quiet, Bonnie, lashes out or whatever. Then you
I don't know that anyone in the history of the world has ever described me as quiet, but for the sake of, of this role play, we'll go with it.
Yeah.
So let me ask you a question. What do you do in the instance where you are not in a position to lean into recovery? So for instance, you had a massive event happen in your life or within business that is really put your feet to the fire where you have to act and you have to act now and you're overwhelmed and you know it.
Yeah.
But you have to perform.
Yeah. Great question. This is exactly what I mean when I say like it's best to decide your recovery plan early, right? Including a filter for how you're going to make your decisions. Right? So what I'll usually teach is that you depending upon how overwhelmed you are, how burned out you are, okay, you might fall in a certain stage, and I've got a visual that I'll send to you for your readers where it's called the recovery pyramid. Okay, and the more compromised you are, the lower you start on that pyramid. At the very bottom, like you got to think about, like, you're so compromised you can't even go to work. Like, you shouldn't be making decisions at that stage of the game. You should have already designated who's going to step in for you, or you should have made all of your kind of larger scale decisions known of how you make the decision, what decision you want made and how. So if you can't have somebody else make it in the moment, then you say, okay, I'm going to make any decisions I can in advance and let somebody know this is how I expect decisions to be made, right? But you don't want to be burned out trying to decide that in the moment, because then you're overwhelmed, your emotions are all over the place, you don't have clarity, you don't have focus, you've got all of these things getting in the way, right? So all those, that kind of, as much as you can, should be planned ahead of time. I usually tell folks, like, write down to what you're going to have for breakfast, because when you're in a state of overwhelm or burnout, you don't want to make any decisions if you can manage it. You want to outsource as much as you can.
An analogy that I think of as it relates to this is when people are going through stressful times and they know that they're stress eaters, it's like by eating the same things for every meal and every snack and just only having those things available to you, it's like a great preventative mechanism from you just going completely off the rails and having a bender because of the stress that you're bringing home.
Yeah, because decision fatigue is a real thing, right? And it's costly. So if you're already in a state of depletion and you can take 20 decisions off your plate for that day, no pun intended, then why wouldn't you? Right? So it's like, okay, I don't have to decide what I eat for breakfast. I don't have to decide what I have for a snack. I don't have to decide, where I'm going to get my water from. Like, if the more you can save yourself from spending energy, the quicker your recovery. And then once you do that, that moves you into the final pillar, which is mental resilience, right? And resilience is recovery over time. So it's the ability to recover consistently and effectively over time. So in the beginning, when people are caught in a burnout cycle where it's like, okay, Bonnie, every 3 months or every 2 months, every 6 months, I'm burning out. Then the goal isn't, okay, we work together and you never burn out again. But the first goal might be, okay, if you're burning out every 3 months, let's see if we can get it to every 6 months. Right? Let's do what it takes. So it's like, okay, you know that every eight months to a year you burn out. And now let's make sure that it's less impactful. So I might still burn out, once every 8 months or whatever the case may be, but I no longer have to take 2 weeks off work.
And I can identify it sooner.
Exactly. And when I am in a burnout, I have a whole regimen for myself. Here's what I eat. Here's the people I talk to. Here's the people that I avoid for a couple of weeks, right? Here are the tasks that I hand off, and here's who I hand them off to. The more you can describe that to me before you need it, the better I know your recovery is going to be.
Be like, I need to go to a cabin and just have Bonnie sit across from me
Yeah, that's right.
for the whole weekend.
And you know what? Like sometimes that's the piece of it too, right? Sometimes it's literally just, I have all these problems, and if I had some place where I could just take them and dump them, if I had a person that because I don't want to do that, with my spouse, because now when I get better, they're going to be like, well, are you okay? Or like, now they're going to worry. Okay. I don't want to do it with my kids. I don't necessarily want to do it with my staff. So what I hear a lot of people say is, Bonnie, I just don't have anybody to tell this stuff to. I don't have anybody to say, I want to quit today, right now. If you gave me $13, we call them $13 days, right? If you give me $13, I'll sell you everything. So, one of the things that we do is I say, hey, listen, just rant. We have an app. They hop into the app and they go, this is where I'm at today. This is what's going on, blah, blah, blah. And they just get it out. And
why do you think it's important? So you talked about not making knee-jerk decisions and, taking the time to process information before moving forward. So then why do you think it's so important for people when they are in that frame of mind to just like pour it all out?
When you pour it all out, what you're actually pouring out is the energy associated with it. Right? So if I am, let's say if I'm feeling overwhelmed with everything, life, baby, this, that, the other thing, whatever the case may be, and I keep that in, what happens is I'm having that dialogue, but I'm having it inside. And if I'm having it inside, there's nobody to give me an alternate perspective. There's nobody to say, yeah, I get it. I understand why you feel that way. So there's nobody to soothe me. There's just me recycling everything that's bothering me. And every time I recycle it, guess what happens? The energy associated with it goes up. And I make it feel heavier. Then I tell myself the story again. Then I say, oh, and by the way, I spilled my coffee. Oh, and by the way, the dog peed on the floor. And now I'm pulling in all this stuff without even realizing it. Because when you start to become emotionally all over the place, that's what you do. You start now to look for problems because you're moving your nervous system into a state where it's designed to look for additional problems. So by having somebody on the outside, you can say those problems out loud, not worry about the consequences of like somebody coming back to you in 2 weeks' time and being like, yeah, but you remember when you told me you wanted to quit there that time? Right? You have a safe space and you get the energy out. And
that's what I was going to say. I see it as like there's a bit of a catch-22 here because there's that part of you that realizes that the thoughts are irrational. And by externalizing them to somebody else, your fear is that they believe now that that's actually what you think.
Yes. That's why I said it's important to have a safe space, right? Because, like I said, and it's normal because.
So don't turn to Twitter.
Oh God, please don't turn to Twitter. Don't do it. Listen, you text me any hour of the night, just don't turn to Twitter, whatever it takes, right? But you're absolutely right. And I think part of having a safe space is knowing that you're talking to somebody who understands it's momentary, right? Who's not like, oh, well, okay, yep, Derek must be ready to quit. Like that, it's all over, right? And then the next day you're fine. I'm like, what happened? I thought we were quitting. I thought, what are we doing? Right? So you just got to have somebody that has a much larger view of you and your success and where you want to go. And then it's their responsibility to hold on to that picture when you forget it.
Yeah, that's finding that person is like a golden goose. It's like once you find it, you hold on to it.
Yeah, and it's really, when we look at mental resilience, there's two sides of it. One is your resilience compromising factors, the things that make you less resilient, right? Like some of us came up with clingy friends, right? Or some of us have, lots of maybe some substance abuse or maybe a history of trauma, whatever the case may be. We all have something, right? And sometimes us avoiding those things or not resolving those things can have them show up at times in ways where they compromise our performance, right? Contrary to that, you have your resilience enhancing factors like mentorship, which is what we're talking about, or coaching, right? Or some people are in therapy, or they just got a really good business partner or best friend, right? Or they have a faith, right? We really don't often talk in business enough about faith. And when I say faith, I'm not necessarily just talking about a religious faith, right? That's one kind of faith. But faith is really anything that ends with, and then I'll be okay, right? So um, when we're thinking about faith, we tend to go to like a church-based faith or religion, or whatever the case may be. But ultimately, you might have a really close family unit who supports you, and it's like, listen, like I've got faith that whatever comes up, me and my family will figure it out, right? Or maybe it is a religious faith, or maybe it's like, you know what, I've never been, I've always been there for myself and never let me down. If I can just go for a nice long walk in the woods, get my head clear, I know that I'll figure this out. It doesn't matter what you have faith in. All the studies say whatever you have faith in, it's the act of faith that's important, right? And so it could be I have faith in my mentor, right? I have faith in Derek. Derek will come up with all the answers that I need to change my life.
Don't put all that on me, Bonnie. So interestingly, what I was thinking about is all of those 6 pillars are around optimizing for performance, or at least optimizing for it over time.
Yeah.
But one thing that I have found personally, and I'm sure you've seen this with plenty of others, is the definition of performance changes over time.
Mm-hmm.
So while we may have had competence in all or some of those pillars previously, we can almost hit the reset button as we make transitions into new phases of business ownership, life, you name it. So have you seen this difficulty for people to make those adjustments and understand they now have to relearn the ropes in this new role or position that they're in?
When I'm talking about performance, and I'm so glad you brought this up because I think definitions are really important, right? When I'm defining performance for the C-suite, the executives, owners, whatever the case may be, I'm talking about the ability to problem solve. That's what we perform at. That's what we do as leaders. As leaders, we're just solving problems and helping other people solve problems, right? So when you can narrow it down to something that specific, you can apply it to everything. And it works just as effectively. All those 6 pillars, building those 6 pillars works no matter what problem you're trying to solve. If it's a relationship problem, if it is a parenting problem, if it's a CEO level problem, if it's a hiring problem, it's all the same, right? Because they're all just different kinds of problems. Maintaining mental and building mental fitness is about putting your nervous, keeping and keeping your nervous system in a state where you have the best chance at solving problems effectively.
What do you think is happening when there's not this like universal application of competency in all areas? So for instance, you have the CEO who is incredibly dialed as it relates to all of these pillars in the business, but in his relationships, there's neglect or an inability to recover or maintain relationships and those sort of things within those pillars outside of his expertise inside of the business. Like what's happening there when there's not the carryover?
It's a change of context, essentially. And the thing that why context is so important is because let's say that CEO is at work and he's just in his zone of competence. He knows exactly what to do, when to do it. Everybody listens to him. He can sell the vision perfectly, right? At home, there's something that's different about the context that he's responding to. Now, we don't necessarily know what that is. Let's say when he goes home, he never he never wants to say no to his wife, right? So at work, he can say no to some people because that's his role and he needs to do that sometimes. But at home, his definition of loving his partner is whatever she says or whatever she wants, I just say yes to, right? And so in that, you've got some conflicting values. You got the value of like, yeah, okay, I want to make responsible decisions, but I also have this other value that says I want to keep this person happy. And if I only know one way to do it, it's possible that those two values will conflict. So depending upon what the context is, you may have different values or different desired outcomes that actually cause problems. And then when you add people to things, I mean, that, those factors increase exponentially, right? Because you might see, okay, this is exactly how we should do it. And some other person goes, can we do it differently? Now the context is different. Now you've got to soothe everybody. Right?
I had an old friend and therapist who used to say to me, mental health is authenticity. And I used to say back to him, yeah, but who I am at work can't be who I am at home, because if Coach Derek shows up in his marriage, the marriage is not going to be sticking around for very long.
Exactly. Yeah, Coach doesn't make it past the doorstep, right? And I think this idea of, I heard somebody say a long time ago, like, I am who I am. And I'm like, you are who you are right now. Like, I don't expect, just like you said, like, you wouldn't treat, the person that served you at dinner, whatever the case may be. Like, you wouldn't tell that person the things that you tell your spouse, right? Not because they're any lesser or whatever the case may be, but because there are certain conversations that we have with certain people that are, that we feel safe with and comfortable with, right? Now, some people are like, yeah, I would tell anybody everything. We'll leave that where it's at, right? But it's okay to have context dependent behaviors. You need to have them. That's what's called etiquette, right? Those are the confines of etiquette.
Yeah, it's context is so fascinating, because as it relates to like getting advice from people or giving advice, it's like you need both alignment, like you're on my side,
Mm-hmm.
and you need context, right? And
Yeah.
then there's obviously that knowledge piece too, which is like you could have context but not know how to fix my problem, right?
Yeah.
You could be in alignment with me, I think of my mom, right? Like
Yeah.
I can't go to her for business advice. She never owned a business, right? She's in
Mm-hmm.
total alignment. She wants the best for me, and she has moderate context, but like zero knowledge in that field.
Yeah.
And then it's like if I talk to a therapist, like they might have, I might be in alignment, all the context, zero knowledge. So it's interesting, this dynamic that we experience in the relationships we form with friends, family, coworkers, therapists, mentors, because there's that kind of that trifecta going on at all times.
Mm-hmm. You can remove that limitation by identifying the difference between advice and perspective. So your mom might not be able to give you business advice, but she may be able to give you an alternate perspective, right? So she sits outside of a business. She sits outside of owning a business. You sit inside of owning a business. So if you're looking at a problem, you might say, "Hey, mom, this is what I'm dealing with," and her give you the perspective of being outside the business. That may be helpful for you, right? So it doesn't mean that that's where you go all the time to solve all your problems. But if know whether or not you're seeking advice, whether or not you need advice, or whether or not you need perspective. Advice is, what should I do? Perspective is, what do you see? Do you see what I see? Right? And sometimes we actually need perspective a lot more than we need advice.
Isn't there an exercise in psychotherapy called Johari's window? It has to do with, basically, it's like every person has blind spots based on the way that they see the world.
Mm-hmm.
So by utilizing the information you can take in from people around you, you can help fill in those blind spots, which
That's
in
right.
essence is perspective.
It's exactly what it is. Yes. Yeah. Because so what I say to folks is like, okay, you imagine you've got a circle of people around a house. Okay. And so we're all holding hands. We're all lined up around this house. And I say, you're on the opposite side for me. And someone says to me, "Hey, Bonnie, how many windows are in the house?" And I count from what I can see, 1, 2, 3, 4. Right? Now you might be on the back side of the house and there's no windows there. Someone asks you the same thing. And you'll say, "Well, no, there's only one." Right? But if you put your perspective and my perspective together, you get a fuller picture. Right? So that's why perspective can be so much better than advice. Right? Because my advice would be like, go buy 3 windows. Your advice would be go buy 1 window. Right? So, but the perspective of both of our positions combined helps us make a fuller decision, a better set of decisions. Now, in order to do that, you have to have good relationships. You have to have people that are willing to give you a perspective that's rooted in your best interest. That's important, right? You have to have the ability to listen. You have to have your ego in a place where you're willing to say, "Well, what do you see? I'd like to consider it from your point of view." Right? So there's lots of skills that are within that are subsets of that particular practice, but it can be incredibly powerful.
Yeah, one of the things that I have found, and this will be a good kind of crossover between the athlete, or at least better yet, the fitness enthusiast and the business owner, is that by the nature of the fact that there's just far few of them in both of those camps, it can be really difficult because you have a lot of people that love and care about you that don't understand all of the ins and outs of why you're doing what you're doing. Yeah. And because of that, so I'll use the fitness enthusiast just to kind of relate to the audience. There are a lot of people that I have worked with and continue to work with where almost everyone in their life, although they care about them, is trying to convince them that what they're doing is too much, or why they shouldn't care that much, and why they shouldn't pour that much time into their physical fitness and health. And it's a really difficult puzzle to piece together, because you're constantly at odds with the people that you care about and care about you most, despite the fact that you genuinely believe deep down that you're doing the right thing for yourself. Yeah. And I know the same thing probably exists for a lot of business owners. So can you speak to that?
Yeah. And that often triggers that comparison complex too, right? Is when we're giving advice, right, to somebody that we care about, we genuinely want to give it from a place, a place of love and what we think would actually be helpful for them. Where we get into trouble is that we pull from our own perspective, right? So we have a memory of like, hey, listen, like when I was, when I kind of brought down when I changed my workouts or eased up on my workouts, that was really good for me, right? When I decided to go from 5 days a week to 3 days a week, that was really good for me. So in that moment, what happens is you actually recall that transition. You remember, you pull up those physical sensations of that memory, and you're like, wow, yeah, this is good advice. But you don't realize it was good advice for you. It was your experience, because we think that our experience, and it's, that's not normal, is the experience. It's not until we offer or we invite additional perspective that we see that there could be another way of doing things. Otherwise, we'd be exhausted with everything, right? So our brain says, look, I'll do me until something gives me a reason to think about a different way to do it. But when we give advice, it's from what worked for us, right? When we give an opinion, it's like, and that's why I would say, like, if you want to give someone advice, say, can I offer to you what worked well for me? So that we know I'm not telling you what you should do. I'm just saying, from my perspective, this is the information I have. You do what you want with it. But sometimes you'll have people give advice or guidance based on their own internal conflict, right? So, I'm from the East Coast of Canada, there we call it crabs in a bucket, right? Where you are growing, you're challenging yourself, you're doing new things, you're doing all this work, and, you're reaping the rewards of that. But you might have a social group, or you might have somebody in that social group that's very uncomfortable with the way in which you are changing. And they're used to interacting with you a certain way. Maybe they're used to going out and partying on the weekends, and having a free for all, and then waking up Monday hungover and ha 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 ha. Right now, all of a sudden, you don't want to do that anymore with them. And the internal conflict that can generate can make it easier for them to go, man, you don't need to work out today. You don't need to do that. You don't need to go in the office today. You own the place. Who cares? They'll be fine without you. Right? Come party with us. And so, in the name of keeping consistency in their lives, they might be giving you that advice. So you can get advice from somebody's personal experience that's really good for you. You can get advice from somebody's personal experience that's really tough. That's why it's always best to look for just perspective, right? And perspective comes with why. Oh, why do you want to do that? What's in it? Like, why is that a good thing for us to do? Right? And then you think about it, and then you decide on your own.
I love that. All right. Last thing before we dive into some action items for everyone listening. The use of labels. So, something you see in a lot of employers nowadays is they're running these personality tests to have a better understanding of who the person is that's coming into their company, so that they can place them in the right role and figure out if they're going to be a good fit. Mm-hmm. And we're also living in a world where it's becoming more and more normalized to place labels on yourself. And while in some ways I can see this to be a benefit in just like having a better sense and understanding of yourself, I also see them as limiters, because once you label yourself, it's really hard to unlabel yourself. Yeah. So, I always think of this example, like there was a podcast I was listening to, and someone said, you're not introverted. You just have shitty friends. If you get around the right people, you'll never stop talking. And like, I'm not an introvert, but I still appreciated that
Yeah.
because I do know plenty of introverts where if you talk to them about the thing they want to talk about, they are some of the most fascinating people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure, for sure. I'll I will admit transparently, I am not a fan of labels. I got a real issue with labels, and the reason for that, I mean, I've been in mental health now over 12 or 13 years, and I see the damage that internalizing a label can do. Right. So I've seen people from labels from PTSD to ODD to bipolar to everything you can imagine. Right. Um, and my favorite one is the narcissist. Everybody knows the narcissist nowadays, right? And they're just not that abundant in the population, you know. So labels can be very dangerous because when we get emotional and overwhelmed, we use them for reasons that have nothing to do with the good of the person being labeled. Okay. So what we want to be careful of when it comes down to these, and I'm not saying that these personality inventories don't have a place and that they can't be useful, but I'm more, when I'm working with people, I'm more interested in the why, right? If you work better alone and um, you're very organized and neat and you are a perfectionist, I want to know why. Because if we can figure out how you ended up there, so if we think about, of all of the behaviors your brain allowed you to choose, these are the ones that it chooses. I want to know why. Because you learned when you were young, in your younger years, how to do the world, but in that setting you learned a special way. That's why we don't all do things the same way. So what I want to know is not just, okay, well, how well do you work with people, and I want to know why. Because I may assume that that's just who you are, but that might be just how you cope, right? Like you might just be afraid of being rejected, so you got really used to working by yourself so that you didn't have to expose yourself to rejection. Well, that's fine. And like, okay, so if it just reads that you work really well independently, and I decide at some point I actually do want to pull you into a group because I don't have the option for you to work independently, I want to understand what I'm risking by pulling you into this group or suggesting that you become a part of this group. Right. So it's not just about what are your behaviors. Anybody can sit back and say, okay, here are my patterns. These are the things I do fairly quickly, but it's the why behind them. And everybody's is different.
Probably becomes even more dangerous when you start placing some of these beliefs onto kids.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I had a young fellow in my practice, just love that. Just, not that I have favorites, but one of my favorites. Um, and he had every diagnosis you could imagine, right? And so when it came down to it, it was they believed that one of the big struggles with, he was diagnosed as autistic, was that he couldn't interact with others, right? Just didn't like other people basically before he had gotten this label. And what it came down to was like there are certain things when he walks into a room, he knows there are certain things that make him feel comfortable, right? If you can accept that he doesn't want to make eye contact with you, it's perfectly fine. Talk all day. Ask him something about his interest. Talk forever. And this was someone who, as a child, had been labeled as hard to get along with, not interested in engaging, didn't like school. And it's like none of those things are true. An avid reader now, incredible quick learner, doing incredibly well in college. So like you have these experiences where if you ask somebody, what does the label mean to you, or what did it, what changed for you when you got the label, it's very rarely super negative, super positive, right? Because they always think about the limitations. So ADHD is a really common one. And I have a lot of entrepreneurs who are like, oh my god, Bonnie, I need you to know, and like, I got ADHD, I can't think straight. I'm like, oh, that's fine. I'm like, what are all the things that ADHD has allowed you to do? Right. So I see it as a superpower. I'm like, what are all the things? So usually high visionary, very creative. When they're focused on things they like, they really focused. And you'd be surprised how reframing that label frees people up and allows them to move out of shame and depression and feeling like they're inadequate. Right. So labels in some cases were intended to be helpful, but they can, if you're not careful, they can be really, really destructive.
So the way you see it is most people use these labels as ways of creating limits for themselves. They say, I have ADHD, so I cannot do this, or my behaviors tend to push me in this direction.
Yeah. That's just how I am. Oh, I'm a perfectionist. No, you have high anxiety. Right? Let's figure out why you have high anxiety. I mean, I like the fact that you really want to get your work done, but I also want you to acknowledge that that is not a skill, right? That's a coping mechanism.
So in other words, it's like the difference between the symptom and the problem.
That's right. That's right.
All right. So let's put a bow on this whole thing. So what are some action items that people can take with them if they're looking to improve their mental fitness?
The first thing I would say to everybody is look at your schedule and look in two directions. Look back in the last 14 days and identify what were the activities you did that you felt like filled up your cup, right? And like, we all say fill your cup, but they felt like when you were done, you're like, oh, that's nice. I don't do that enough. Find a way to have those activities in your next 2 weeks or some version of them, right? So it might be, I got to go to the grocery store and shop, at 10 o'clock at night. You might not be able to do that a lot, but it's the quality of that activity that you've identified as an input. So you go back, you find the things that fill your cup, or the things that you would do if I gave you all the money in the world that you needed and said you don't have to work for the next 2 weeks. What would you do? The first 5 things on your list are probably going to be your inputs. Find a way to incorporate them or a quality of those things into every week, right? So if you don't take breaks throughout your day, start with 1 15-minute break. Get outside of the building, right? And just allow yourself to be for 15 minutes. Right? Some of the easy wins, as I'm sure you well know, is like food, water, and light. Go outside and get some light. And if you live in Northern Ontario, that's a little tougher nowadays. But, food, water, and light. Go and eat some good food. Make sure that you're hydrated and go outside for a little while. And if you can't go outside, just go stand by your picture window or whatever the case may be. But change your orientation. I know some people that work in offices that they've got minimal light and minimal, windows to based on where they are, the cubicles are, 8 hours a day. They have no exposure to light or minimal exposure to light. Like, we're not built for that. Right? Identify the things that pull from you. Are there things that you're exposing yourself to right now that you don't have to? Right? Is there a really difficult family member, right, that you just want to be different so bad you keep arguing with them or whatever the case may be, that you can just give that up for a little while, let people be where they need to be? Is there, are there habits? Are you coming home and having a bottle of wine when you get stressed that you need to say, look, I need to reduce that, or I need to eliminate that altogether? Right? So the best advice I could give right away is start paying attention to your capacity. Pay attention to what fills you up and what actually makes you feel like, okay, I could go for another hour or two. And find ways to incorporate that into your schedule right now today. So the rule is you shouldn't be able to see 48 hours in your calendar without having a block for you, without having a restorative block. Right. So
I love it.
Start there. Right. And then after that, I will send you the document on recovery, and it's pretty easy. The more burnt out you are, the lower you start. And on that pyramid, you'll see on the bottom, it's like basically resourcing the body. So it's good nutrition, water, light, all that kind of stuff. And then to the right hand side of the pyramid, you will see what to do about your responsibilities. So at that level, you're going to outsource everything that you can. I usually say to folks, like, if you were, 2 months with 2 broken legs in your bed, what would you get rid of and how would you do it? That's the bottom level, and it goes up from there. It's pretty self-explanatory, but it can give people an idea of what it would take to recover well.
Yeah, and we'll include that in the show notes for everybody. So, Bonnie, thank you for shooting that over our way. Well, hey, I really appreciate you coming on. This has been a blast. And like I said, to start the show, it was something that I was looking forward to for quite a while now. So thanks again for coming on. Tell everyone where they can learn more about what you do, and if they wanted to possibly work with you, how to get set up.
Yeah, actually, you can pop over to my website. So it is yourmentalfitness.ca. If you click on the homepage there's a big link above that says get your mental fitness plan. There are some questions that'll walk you through a mental fitness assessment, and we can hop on a call, do a review, and talk a little bit about kind of what your particular struggles are and challenges are and how you can get through them.
Awesome. Bonnie, thanks so much for coming on.
All right. Thanks so much, Derek. Pleasure.